Today, I'm very excited to welcome Doran Larson, celebrating the release of Inside Knowledge, Incarcerated People on the Failures of the American Prison. Doran Larson is an Edward North Professor of Literature at my lovely alma mater, Hamilton College. He's the author of Witness in the Era of Mass Incarceration, editor of Fourth City, Essays from the Prison in America, and he founded and co-directs the American Prison Writing Archive. He also has organized 2 college prison programs in New York State. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Doran Larson.
Thank you. All right, everybody hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. A little louder? Okay. A little bit closer. All right, thanks to everyone who was involved in setting up this event, and thanks to you all for coming out. Just to give you an outline, I'm going to do a short PowerPoint to walk you through the history first of the American Prison Writing Archive, which is really gave birth to this book. Then I'll explain, what the relationship between the book and the archive is. And then I'll do a short reading from the book, and then we'll open it up for your questions. Okay. So all of my work in prisons started, and also please note the website is also on the card that was on your chairs, prisonwitness.org. All right. So all of my work in prison started at Attica Correctional Facility. Attica, of course, famously is the site of the 1971 uprising, which for 4 days, 1,300 men took over one of the recreation yards at Attica, held it, and spoke with and negotiated with lawmakers, journalists, lawyers, basically to bring in humane conditions inside the institution. It was tense but peaceful negotiation until the massacre that took place on September 13th, largely motivated because then Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was in close conversation with Nixon, President Nixon throughout this period, was essentially politicking essentially to be his running mate in the next election. And he had been seen as being soft on crime. Responding to that reputation, he also brought in shortly thereafter the Rockefeller drug laws, which really launched, in a practical sense, the war on drugs, which Nixon first announced during his first term. So I put these pictures up not because I was there during that time, but rather because the atmosphere that the men were rebelling against in 1971 is the atmosphere in Attica today, right? And one thing to understand about carceral institutions is that they just don't change much. They have a certain culture. And one facility, as someone has once said, once you've seen one prison, you've seen one prison, right? It has a particular culture that it has there. Attica today is still an institution that has a reputation for the most dangerous people being there are the staff, right? Because it was seen actually as a catchment or punishment facility. As people say inside, if you screw up in life, you go to prison. If you screw up in prison, you go to Attica, all right? That's why, for example, high profile people with high-profile crimes, such as the man who killed John Lennon, are at Attica. So in 2006, out of just sort of odd circumstances, but I can talk about in the Q&A, I started a writing workshop inside Attica, and you'll see here if this works. Yeah, 17 building here in the bottom left. That's the academic building at Attica. I worked in there for 10 years, and the reason I put up the map is that, first of all, this map cannot be introduced to incarcerated people in New York. One of the ways in which prisons control people inside is through disorientation, right? So Heather Ann Thompson, who wrote the 2016 Pulitzer Prize-winning History of Attica, Blood on the Water, sued to have that book introduced into New York State prisons, and she won the case, except that all the maps had to be taken out, right? So people in there could not orient themselves inside. So I worked, as noted there, for 10 years, and though many men came and went from the workshop, there was a core of 6 men that stayed for many years, most of those years, all right? And the first thing that I realized when I was working in prisons is that completely unlike the images that we have in popular media, I often tell my students the more popular media you've seen about prisons, the less you understand about prisons because there's such gross misrepresentation of those folks. What I found, particularly at Attica, where 85% of the people there have violent crimes, if you have people, and these are the men who were in my class, who have violent crimes but have also taken full responsibility for those crimes and literally carry the souls of the people they've killed on their backs day to day, in order to move forward with their lives, it requires a level of self-assessment and reconfiguration that you only see really in recovery groups, right? People who bottomed out their lives, in alcohol or drugs, most of which are folks who are, an overlap, right, with the folks who are in prison too. 85% of all violent crimes in the United States are committed under the influence of drugs, alcohol, and often both. So those 6 men, what I realized, given the internal work that they were doing, the reflective work they were doing, and living inside an institution, which is, from its design in the late 18th century, a closed institution, where the state essentially can do what it will to people inside, right? There's no cell phones, there's no, not many images from inside. Between what they're going through internally and what they're witnessing outside, all I needed to do was to help them learn to write clearly, and they were going to generate documents that were going to be valuable to the world outside. And again, this is just a sampling of their publication record. There's a second book coming out, I think, later this year. The first book that came from one of those men came out in 2016, praised by NPR, Booklist, and all the other places where you want to be praised. Top literary journals, top magazines, right, across the country. One of the men there, John J. Lennon, some of you may have read his work. He's in the New York Times on a regular basis, and he's now a contributing editor at Esquire. Right? So, given that my background is in literary criticism, I became interested in the genre of literary writing by incarcerated people. I spent a couple of summers living in the Cleveland Park district and spending my days at the Library of Congress reading all the books that they could bring me on prison writing from around the world. That led to my first monograph. It was mentioned, Witnessing the Era of Mass Incarceration. And that eventually led to this book, Fourth City Essays from the Prison in America, came out in 2014. It's 71 essays from 27 states. And the remarkable thing I learned in the process of putting that book together is the incredible coherency of the writing coming from these institutions, even though there are around 6,000 legal confinement institutions in this country, and they're spread across all the states. When you gather the writing from them, you can hardly tell they're not from the same place. All right. If you took the state names off these essays, you could hardly tell they were not from a single institution. So I would say this body of work was more cohesive, more coherent than you would get if you were surveying what's life like in LA, Chicago, or Chicago or New York, right? Because there are very clear restrictions on the way people live in prisons, which there are. And in some sense, freedom is the freedom to live very differently, one person to the next, even in the same place, right? That's not a freedom that exists inside prisons. The title comes from the fact that at the time, if you added the prison and jail population, it was a population just behind Chicago's, right? So it literally added up to the 4th largest city. Houston has since grown, prison's population's dropped down a bit, so it's more like the 5th now. But if you add all the people on parole, probation, etc., it's about the size of metropolitan New York City. Okay. So the deadline for that book passed in 2012, but essays kept coming and coming and just kept coming. So we'd get cover letters saying, I know your deadline is passed. I know this is not going to be published, but I want you to read my story, right? People were really desperate, obviously, to have their stories told. And that led to the creation of the American Prison Writing Archive. A colleague at Hamilton College fortunately had landed a Mellon grant to start digital humanities projects, and this is an obvious example a prospect, because I couldn't get another. It'd taken me a couple of years to find a publisher that would do Fourth City. I got a note from an agent saying, this is a book for people who can't afford to buy it, right? No one's going to sell your book, right? No one's going to publish your book. Luckily, they were wrong. It did come out. These are some current stats on the archive. Right now, there's 3,654 essays, 1,200 in process. We receive, as I'll note in the next slide, between 40 and 100 new essays every month. So the archive is growing by the size of about one more volume of Fourth City every month. All right. And if you add those up, that comes to right now 66 volumes. And Fourth City is a big textbook size, fairly small font book, right? So the production from inside is really remarkable. Actually, I want to back up just a second before that. Another way of thinking about the size of the archive is the word count that we have right now, and again, it's growing, literally daily, is 62% of the word count of all known North American slave narratives. That is to say, within a predictable number of years, within 4 years, we will have more first-person witness to the experience of mass incarceration than exists of slavery in the United States. All right, and there are obvious historical, thematic, and sort of moral connections, all right, between those two bodies, which we can talk about. So I just wanted to show you what it looks like. You can pull this up on your phone, but this is what the archive looks like. About half of the work that we receive is handwritten. And this page is quite typical. Because commissary prices, where people buy their paper in prisons, is quite expensive, they will literally use every square centimeter, of that page. Others not. They may have more money, they may have better prices, or they may have a decent job inside. And then everything that's handwritten, of course, has to be transcribed because otherwise it would not be searchable. But we also do a second page of the typed work. And most people don't realize, well, first of all, prisons are sort of the last stronghold for manual typewriters in America, right? They have to be clear plastic so that they can be inspected to make sure there's no contraband inside of them. And commissaries charge kind of horrendous prices for the bans. People actually will use ballpoint pens and literally go through and re-ink a ribbon because they're so expensive. But we also get work that was previously published, and they've simply sent us a copy of it, right? Our only restriction, our default position at the archive is to accept everything if it deals with criminal legal system involvement. So somebody writes a great, short story about, or rather nonfiction essay about fishing with their parents when they were a child, that doesn't go in. If they say at the beginning, this is what I think about when I'm in solitary, then it goes in, right? We don't take fiction, and the reason for that is that people bring such sort of automatic skepticism to the writing of incarcerated people that I didn't want there to be any confusion about whether or not this was fiction or nonfiction. As far as we can document this is all nonfiction, but we do take poetry. At first I didn't take poetry, but then we have an advisory board between 4 people. They represent almost 100 years of carceral experience, and 3 of them are nationally recognized poets. They said, you got to have poetry in here, right? But it's the same restriction. It's got to have poetry that deals with their experience of incarceration. So here's the problem that I ran into, and in many ways the book, is an attempt to solve. We have this archive, which has this massive amount of text, right? And it's on a digital platform. It's very easy then to take these essays, which are efforts by incarcerated people to extract themselves from all the statistics that stand around prisons and to present themselves as fully integrated human beings, right, with their own personal dignity. Since it's on a digital platform and we have this amount, it's easy to sort of crunch that back into numbers. Like, what are the most popular, what are the most common verbs? What are the most common adjectives? And we've actually done some of that work collaborating with people at DePaul University. But what it does is it also takes a body of work in which people are trying to present themselves as whole human beings, and it refractures them, right, just into the parts of what they're writing. Now, that's fine. That it's really interesting work. But what I wanted to do is, and this is the table of contents, is to rather do what I call thick indexing. Actually, I'll go back there. Thick indexing. And students at Hamilton College, I have a course I teach in the fall. It's called Curating Prison Witness. Students work in the archive all semester, and they work in teams, and every couple of weeks they turn in what I'm calling a curation. So they pulled out all the essays they can find dealing with, for example, medical negligence, all right, or the horrors of being pregnant in prison, or, the quality of food inside. So that rather than breaking these down into just fragments of the essays, we have these threads, right, of essays on particular topics. So we read the whole essays, but we're looking at the way in which incarcerated people from across the country are confirming how similar these conditions are, right, from place to place. So this book is actually the planned first volume of a series of volumes. We have some guest editors lined up to do other volumes with their particular different focuses. The next one out will be guest edited by Elizabeth Hinton at Yale, and she's working on a volume on violence, how it intersects in the lives of incarcerated people, and how they resist that violence. Heather Ann Thompson, who wrote Blood in the Water, is going to work on a collection from the archive on conditions inside and resistance to those conditions. And Michelle Alexander, author, as many of you probably know, of The New Jim Crow, is interested in the meaning of the words liberty, justice, and freedom from incarcerated people, right? So that's the next volume. This first volume, though, I see as a kind of clearinghouse for those others. And what I do in the book, essentially, is on the basis of the writing of incarcerated people, demonstrate how prisons not only do not achieve their 4 cardinal rationales, but actively defeat them. All right. The opening chapter of the book is a history of the American prison with commentary from incarcerated people from 1799 to the present. And the striking thing, if you read that body of work, Patrick Lyon's testimony from the Walnut Street prison, the first penitentiary experiment in Philadelphia, which started in 1790. The book, again, comes out in 1799, echoes work that we're reading from writers today, right? Inadequate medical care, idleness, filth, medical negligence, they're all the same things. So, what I note in the book is that essentially the prison was, and it really was, a whole part. It was intrinsically built in to the idea of the creation of this nation. And you may note, or you may know, that 5 of the first amendments to the Constitution are about the protection of criminal suspects and the conditions under which they live once they're incarcerated. The 8th Amendment, of course, right? In part because they were trying to move away from the brutal public punishments, right, that had been in the past. Under the monarchy and under the colonial governors, what were called the bloody codes, hanging for what we consider sometimes, to minor crimes, branding, the pillory, et cetera, et cetera. They thought in a new nation, which values all of its citizens, right? We'll set aside the issue of slavery, but that will come up later on because we've got to talk through this. No one can be lost, and no one cannot be redeemed, right? It was a great and a revolutionary idea. Instead of punishing people in the public square, you put them in this space in which they could reflect on their crimes and would naturally, come to realize, what they had done is wrong. Very influenced by the Quakers, of course. But in fact, it just never worked that way. It just never worked, all right? Partly because, I think in part, there was a sense that this is such a new and revolutionary idea, what could possibly go wrong? So there was never built into it the checks and balances that we have on other branches of the government, right? I think the only checks and balances we have now are the testimony of incarcerated people, right? Tell us exactly what you're actually experiencing. What's this doing? The original title for the book was Inside Knowledge, The Lessons Prisons Teach, right? And that's echoed in lines in the book. But it's saying, what are incarcerated people actually learning from their experience? And what we find they're learning is that the system just isn't working, right? It claims to want to mete out retribution, to rehabilitate, to contain and incapacitate, and to teach deterrence. And it just doesn't do those things, right? Quite the opposite, as you'll see chapter to chapter. And then the conclusion, charting the path forward, I recommend ways in which this work. I'm not prescribing this is what we should do with prisons. Most people who study this know what you need to do. One, you need to reduce the size. And the fundamental change that we need is to make prisons forward-looking instead of backwards-looking. The way that we sentence and we incarcerate people is all about what did you do back then in the past. It's not thinking about how do we get you ready for when you come back out. I know this by contrast from having toured a lot of prisons in Northern Europe and having written about this. Day one, it's all about looking forward, right? They practice what's called normalization. They try to make life inside as much like life outside as possible, which when you see the videos on these things kind of, appall Americans, like this is not punishment. They actually, it's an EU rule to minimize the amount of punishment that you mete out only to the extent you need that for public safety, right? To keep some people who are truly dangerous off the streets, all right? And that's a much smaller part of the population than what we have now, and so they have much lower incarceration rates, all right? So that's a fundamental change. But in the last chapter, the only thing I presume to do is to say this is the way in which the right of incarcerated people could be incorporated into academia, into law school training, into popular thought, and eventually to try to influence lawmakers to actually listen to the people on the receiving end of the decisions they make to figure out what's actually going to work for them, right, and for the broader society. All right. So I will now read from the preface of the book. Basically gives you the talk that I just gave you. So the introduction is called Why Prison Witness Matters. And that's one of the arguments of the book, is essentially to say that it does. In 1974, on the cusp of the American prison's expansion toward its current mass scale, Justice William O. Douglas wrote that, quote, people have the right and the necessity to know not only of the incidence of crime, but of the effectiveness of the system intended to control it, unquote. Popular media, political debate, and high-profile cases have made parts of the system the stuff of daily conversation. Arrest, charging, and courtroom procedures are practices of which most people feel they have at least some cursory understanding, however ill-informed they may in fact be. But TV dramas, news segments, and much of the public debate often end in arrest, arraignment, verdicts, and sentencing. The criminal legal system narratives we witness day to day typically conclude with a suspect handcuffed and pushed into a squad car or escorted from a courtroom, yet far from prison gates. The purpose of this book is to continue that storyline while allowing its living subjects to unmask its myths. Narrated by witnesses who can testify to the most hidden intricacies of its daily workings, Inside Knowledge allows readers to learn from imprisoned people what America's unprecedented experiment in mass-scale incarceration looks and feels and smells like from the inside. It is not a flattering portrait. Imprisoned people with the courage and wherewithal to document what they experience make clear that today's prisons not only degrade and debilitate their wards, they defeat each of the missions we have traditionally asked prisons to fulfill: rehabilitation, containment, deterrence, and even meaningful retribution. These purposes are foundational to legitimizing the existence and operation of prisons, to rationalizing the policing and court systems that feed them, and to locating incarceration's place within democracy. If the mass prison actively defeats its own rationales and justifications for being, then rather than using them as the cardinal reference points in public debate about mass incarceration, we would do better to direct that debate to the mass-scale damage prisons mete out upon individuals and communities. Such a redirected debate, as the voices gathered in this book suggest, can redirect and dismantle thinking about the future of incarceration itself as a method of securing not only legal order, but a constructive, equitable form of justice, one that serves all people and communities, rather than pitting citizens outside against those inside in a struggle that degrades everyone concerned. Incarcerated people today are ready for this renewed debate, and they know the stakes of their testimony. They know that every detail they convey must counter a fog of misinformation produced by popular media, a multi-billion-dollar prison industry, lawmakers beating the drums of law and order, and the perceptions of a public, in legal scholar Jonathan Simon's words, quote, whose infatuation with incarceration depends on deep ignorance as to its fundamental effects, unquote. What prison witnesses reveal is a confined social order made up of people who, even when accepting their culpability, reject the destructive practices that their acts have triggered. Quote, I did something wrong. I deserve to go to prison, writes Brian Nelson after 27 years inside. But I didn't deserve to be tortured, unquote. Our punishments teach profound lessons. They simply are not the ones we might like to believe are taught inside either a democratic nation claiming to respect human rights and dignity, or an institution intended to control crime. What incarcerated people report is that our prisons do not punish so much as they simply damage human beings, rendering them less capable of reintegrating into life outside. We then blame their failures on their lack of moral character. But as one imprisoned California writer observed in 1970, quote, to determine how men will behave once they enter the prison, it is of first importance to know that prison. Men are brutalized by the environment, not the reverse, unquote. And that's George Jackson, by the way, who appears later on in the history. 50 years later, a woman who served years in solitary confinement in New York State suggests that little has changed. Quote, yes, the public is safe for that time while in prison, but now you have this menace who is developing a shitload of other problems. It's like taking a dog, putting it in a cage and mistreating it for years, and then letting it loose in a playground with children. It's going to act exactly how you'd expect it to act, unquote. From Tennessee, a letter addressed to American Justice concludes, quote, I thank you for the pain and unforgettable experiences, American Justice. I thank you for creating a beast, unquote. These voices join a history of prison testimony nearly as old as the nation itself. For over 220 years, incarcerated people have been producing a shadow canon to the famously unruly public texts of American literary history. This better-known canon presents facets of a nation so profoundly pluralistic that we take up each day, as fresh as at our founding, the question of just what we are and what we stand for. Meanwhile, imprisoned writers have built, year by year, decade by decade, a literary corpus that tracks the evolution of an institution, that translates all of our most noble arguments about values, beliefs, justice, and the rule of law into steel and stone and concrete, into education or torture, into conditions for redemption or utter degradation. What legally confined people write of today offers haunting echoes of what others have written since 1799. That few know this is no accident, since the prison is, according to historian Dan Berger, quote, a living archive steeped in a denial of the histories it confines, unquote. And yet people behind bars have documented the steady, disequalizing thrum of human suffering that underlies American claims to blind justice, equity, and the rule of law. These messages are not simply from in there. They unearth the silent foundation beneath the social and legal facts and culture that Americans call here. Whatever images we like to project upon them, imprisoned people see what prisons do, to whom, and to what effects. When they write, they bear witness to how our claims to meting out justice and respecting the rule of law, to seeking equity, and to protecting public safety, serve as a facade masking torturous isolation, arbitrary violence, death by curable disease, and the hourly chipping away at minds and hearts and spirits in environments so intrinsically pathological that even the keepers suffer killing effects. Imprisoned people see cells and recreation yards and mess halls filled with the mentally ill, the indigent, and the hopeless who have been abandoned by job markets and the failing civil services of a society that for over 50 years has preferred to police rather than to assist the poor. They also see the resilience of human beings who may be hardened but refuse to be crushed by their circumstances. Meanwhile, from outside, we project upon the prison's opaque walls assumptions and images that reflect less what imprisoned people are, or what our prisons do, than convenient flatteries to the free public sense of moral righteousness and superior merit. Our prisons have turned Plato's cave inside out. It is those inside who see the true forms of our criminal legal practices, while those outside thrill and tremble before the carnival of shadowy monsters cast across small and large screens. So I will stop there, and I'll open up for your questions and answers. Questions or answers. Maybe has some answers as well. Throw them at me. As mentioned, there's a microphone over here, so if somebody wants to stand up and offer a question, that would be great.
You made an aside about EU prisons being more of a model, and I'm curious, what do you or people in the West know about Russian prisons, such as where Navalny was murdered? If we have hit rock bottom, are they at that place or even worse? That's question one. And two is, are there any decent prisons in this country?
I'll take the second part first. There are prisons that have basically become sort of show places for rehabilitative programs. The first one that comes to mind is San Quentin. One is in the Bay Area, right, surrounded by liberals with lots of skills and training. Virtually anyone who goes to the University of California, Berkeley criminology program probably has taught in their college program at one point or another. So San Quentin has two parts. It's got a maximum security part. It's got a medium security part. All the programs are largely in the medium security part, so people can pass over and go in one or the other. So there are places where there are lots of programs. All right. The other places where the most successful rehabilitative programs have been instituted, not accidentally, are smaller prisons. So there have been quite a number of prison superintendents or wardens who've gone on trips that have been sponsored by nonprofit organizations to actually go and tour prisons in Europe and come back with those different ideas. And essentially what they're learning is you need to be looking forward rather than saying, okay, we just need to hold you and punish you because of something happened when you were 17 years old and you've since aged out of crime, right? We're getting no return on holding you for all these years, right? So what is it that we actually do? So the major problem with really doing, active rehabilitation in the United States is essentially their prison's just too big. You've got too many people. And also, we want mass incarceration on mass scale, but on the cheap. So they're virtually all understaffed, right? At Attica, there's 2,200 men there, 660 prison guards, and they cover 3 shifts, right? So anybody who's at any point, they're usually outnumbered like 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 during certain shifts, all right? That means that staff are always in a state of siege. They're always outnumbered. They're always afraid of organization. And trust me, incarcerated people get a lot more trouble for actually organizing with other incarcerated people than they will for themselves acting out, right? Engaging in violence, right? So we've got that problem is sort of built into the way that we run institutions. In terms of Russia and this, I can put in this package, China and North Korea, we just don't know. They are even more secretive. And the proximity to journalism even changes cultures here, right? In New York State, Sing Sing is a notoriously sort of chaotic prison. And the reason is it's so close to New York City, it actually gets more scrutiny from journalists and others and volunteers that are going in and out. Ted Conover's great book, New Jack, about becoming a New York State prison guard and going through the training and then working there, he works at Sing Sing. He notes regularly throughout that book to say, this would be allowed, for an incarcerated person in Sing Sing. They would never get away with that at Attica, right? At Attica, you'd end up in the hole or you'd get your, a bone broken, if you did this or said this to a corrections officer. So the farther the institutions are from any sort of public, journalists, others who are trying to get the information out, the tougher the institutions are going to be. And that's the case here, and it's the case in those other countries. Is that? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I enjoy it very much. I have several questions, but I'll only ask one until there's nobody else in the line.
We got one.
Yeah, I know. I assume that when they're writing for you, writing essays and so forth, that they understand, and I guess I really need to phrase this differently. Is it the case that that the essays that they write for you may be used in judging, making parole decisions or any other aspects of their incarceration? And if so, what effect do you think that knowledge has?
Yeah.
So that's one question.
Yeah. Let me give you a little bit of context there. Virtually everyone who collects the writing of incarcerated people find that the people with long sentences are overrepresented. The reason is that somebody who's in for like a year or two are not going to put their nose up in the air and get it cut off, right? And get their sentence length, for example, longer. People who write to the archive tend to be people who have long sentences. They've established a sense of their own security, or they have life without parole sentences. This, I'm never going to get out anyway. Or they just don't give a damn anymore, right? They want to do something to try to change things inside. So incarcerated people fully understand what the line is they can go to, right? And what it is to cross over. And some people will cross over, right? So we have restrictions in the archive that we retain the right to not digitize or to redact work that advocates violence, names in ongoing legal cases, or names particular individuals from whom we don't have permission, right, to have written about them. And we do that largely for their own protection.
Right.
All right. I think they'll, it's always a debate with people who do this kind of work. Should we be treating these folks as adults? They've made a decision about what they want to put on the page, right? Should we be second guessing, right, what they're doing? Some folks say that's kind of a patronizing position, right? They should be able to, If this is what they want to put out in the world, this is what they put out in the world. For others, it's no, we've got to keep them safe, right? That's the first priority, even if we're overstepping in that way. So it's an ongoing debate. I can tell you that when I've been in touch, because I contacted, of course, and I'm actually paying all the people who are quoted, the 215 people who are quoted in the book. I've had several letters of just profound appreciation. 2 days ago, I got a letter from a man who said, I've been here for 17 years. I wrote this when I was 6 years in. And at that time, I really thought that I would get out and I would have a future. I lost that hope. I've been pretty much, walking dead for those years since then. But when I got your letter, it was like I came back to myself again. He talked about calling his wife, and they were both in tears because his work was going to go out in the world. So there's a profound appreciation for just getting out. People who are incarcerated feel that sense of isolation. Right. That nobody, and when I teach writing courses, there's always this moment when people say, nobody wants to hear what I want to say. I know what the world thinks about me. And I said, you are the absolute frontline experts about this institution. Nobody has more credibility than you do. And it's kind of a moment like, yeah, you're right. I appreciate that. Yeah. Or they appreciate, what it is they can bring to the table. So there's that, but, it's an ongoing problem. It's not that someone could not use some of this writing, right, to bring back against someone at a parole hearing or something of the sort. And we do give people the right to write anonymously or under pen names. And also, we have a whole, the archive is actually fully searchable. So you can do faceted searches by people's self-identified demographic groups, or you can do keyword searches. But all of that is voluntary because we need to let people present themselves as they choose to present themselves in order to keep themselves safe.
Right.
All right. So we recognize that.
Right. Thank you. Great answer. Very complete.
Oh, thanks.
Hi. So I've been teaching for several years in the detention centers in Northern Virginia, creative writing. And in the back of my mind is always healing. Writing is a very personal thing, a personal benefit. This is new to me, this idea of using it as exposition for others to learn from. So I'm always thinking in terms of writing as healing or as empowering, and I impress that on them, that writing can actually help you. That's not my question. Sure. My question relates to what's happening in Northern Virginia. So some of the Commonwealth's attorneys now are very oriented to the diversion programs. They're diverting from incarceration to mental health care or to addiction treatment. So we have a great decrease in the jail of inmates. Do you view this as a positive change? This is very controversial because these Commonwealth's attorneys are considered soft on crime. But it just occurred to me that there might be more understanding available in the mental health or the addiction services program. So I just wonder what the impact, from your point of view, is of diversion.
Anything that sends people anywhere to the prison is probably a good thing, right? Because the institute just as I say, it just doesn't work. It doesn't really help people. It's not that people inside do not change their lives, but they do that because they put in the work, often directly at odds with the practices of the institution. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I think those are absolutely positive things. It gets closer to, what we do often see in the models in Europe. There are all kinds of options short of, and they try to do everything short of incarcerating people because they don't know it's not effective. And also their system's incredibly expensive. They, in many Northern European prisons, the staff to incarcerated people ratio is 1 to 1. Right. So that everybody's got someone they're in a contact. And also this is sort of, off a sidebar, but corrections officers in the United States have a 15-year shorter life expectancy than other people because of epidemic levels of suicide, of alcoholism, domestic violence, hypertension, you name it. And this is something that people studied after the Second World War, right? Guards in death camps. if you spend your whole day just hurting people and doing negative things, that's going to come home with you, right? That doesn't, we're not built to do that. And so in those prisons, staff, one, you actually have to have a level of university training. It's an envied job. It has social capital, right? It's a respected job. And I've often said the level of respect for prison officers in Europe is about what we have for EMTs, right? They're not doctors, but you really are glad they're there, and you hope they do the job really well. All right. And so people can actually proudly say, I work, as a prison officer. Here, our the social capital of people who work in prisons is hardly higher than the people they're looking after. And they're often, I just got a letter from a guy the other day. He says, I wanted to write to you back that my brother's also in prison, and we have two other brothers who are guards. Right? Guards and incarcerated people often come from the same neighborhoods, the same freaking households, right? Because it's basically practically a desperation job in areas where they don't have other jobs. Central New York, if you look at the map, it's remarkable. It mentioned I organized a couple of college programs. I was looking at the map of New York State of all the colleges, universities in the SUNY system, State University of New York system, and all the prisons. They're the same map. In one generation, to generate jobs upstate, you got a university. In another generation, you got a prison. Right? So these are largely job generation. That's what it was. I mean, it was a sort of, devil's convenience, as it were, that we needed jobs in those places where agriculture had gone away, and at least as a viable living, manufacturing had gone away, but you could give a place a prison. Our county, Oneida County, where Hamilton is, we have 3 prisons. We used to have 4. It's one of the major employers, there. So it kind of went off to the side, but yeah, I think, anything that sends people anywhere for a prison, and also to get them out of jail, because jails are much bigger than prisons. People don't realize, is because people are there temporarily, supposed to be there temporarily. They're much bigger. They're much more chaotic. And I have had several men say, I plead out, meaning I just made an agreement, to get out of here, because I had to get the hell out of Rikers. I wasn't going to survive in that place. At a time when it was 14,000 people. The largest prisons in the country are like 6,500, right? Cook County Jail, LA County Jail. These are massive, chaotic, dangerous places.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
First, congratulations on the work you're doing. It's important, very important. One basic question. Can you talk to the difference between private prisons and public prisons as far as the response of the prisoners, the treatment and so forth? Is there a difference? And what have you experienced?
There is. The difference is actually not as hard and fast as people generally assume. 8% of incarcerated people in the United States are in private prisons. So it's not an enormous part of that population. Also, the difference is not that great because many of the services in state prisons and federal prisons are actually contracted out to private companies, right? That could be food, medical care, transportation, even parole, right? Could be. So in some sense, you've not gotten away from the financial interests in keeping the institution at a certain size simply because you've gone to the state prisons. That said, private prisons basically sell a bill of goods, right? That they can basically make this cheaper for states by underpaying people. And it's not accidental that you'll find the most private prisons in states where you have a weak or no union among corrections officers, right? California notoriously has a corrections officers union, which is probably more powerful than any other body, in that state. They basically wrote criminal justice policy for California for many, many years. New York State, similarly. The federal government, though, where the private companies have expanded, is in federal detention, right? So people who are undocumented immigrants, those have blown up, and they're largely private. Interesting contrast. I mentioned Ted Conover's book about work in the New York State prison system. There's also a book, blocking the name's name. It's just called American Prison by Sean Bauer. and he worked in a private prison in Louisiana, and literally like an afternoon of training, and then he has complete command, over other people, and getting $9 an hour, right? They're just horrendous. I mean, prisons are bad, right, in the U.S. And I talked to many actually incarcerated people in Europe to say, well, at least I'm here and I'm not in prison there, right? I'm doing 2 years. I'd be doing 15 or 20, right, if I were in your country. And they get lots of news about American prisons. So I mean that's where things are. With the
Thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So I kind of have like a two-parter question.
Sure.
The first one is, where do we, with all the problems that like exist in prisons and like within the prison system, where do you think prison reform should start? Like, whether that be treatment of incarcerated people, or like the corrections officers, things like that. And the second part is, what can people on the outside, people like us, what can we do to sort of like raise awareness about that, and I guess put that on like our elected officials' radars, that it would be something that we are interested in and advocating for them.
Yeah. You probably, and I'm sure in DC you have many organizations that are trying to reduce incarceration. So joining those groups, working with them, right? And doing the things that, they tell you in civics classes, if they still teach civic classes any place you've ever been. Write to representatives, right? Phone call them. Tell them it's something that matters to you, right? Those sort of, the classic methods, but I think, they're important. In terms of the actual reform inside, as I mentioned, just reduce the numbers, right? That's really crucial at the very beginning. But I think that the thing that would make the most, aside from a complete shift in philosophy, as I mentioned, looking forward rather than looking backward, is more training for staff. They have, people who work in prisons know that they survive in their job because of their ability to communicate with incarcerated people, right? And that's almost no part of their training, right? And, as many critics have said, it's just a turn to recognize these are human beings, right? And maintaining that sense that these are human beings and they have as complex a set of responses, emotionally, psychologically, as anybody else, right? All that typing is just, it's we don't think about the prejudice that exists against incarcerated people, obviously, the way we do about, people of color, right? Or people who are handicapped, et cetera, or disabled. But in fact, we really treat incarcerated people as though they were a whole other species. We talk about them that way, right? Even on a liberal venue like NPR, I remember there's an interview with a neurologist, and the interviewer is saying, do you think someday we'll be able to understand their criminal mind? Like there's some sort of biological, core to people getting involved in crime. People get in crime because they're desperate, right? Because they don't have the things they need, There was a great study done of street level drug dealers. And they said, what are your values? What do you want in your life? They were extremely traditional. I want a home. I want a stable relationship, right? I want a steady income. I want to be doing something I can be proud of. But that's not available right now, right? This is the market that exists. So this is the market, that I'm working in and trying to feed my siblings or, whoever else. So just recognizing the fact, where crime comes from, right? It's to see it more as a symptom, right, of a structural problem rather than a type of individuals that get involved, right, which are obviously, racially, class marked. Those are sort of fundamental things. Yeah. And also, one of the problems with reducing the prison population is that this is such an enormous source of jobs, right? We just, if we tried to do this, and at the end of the 1960s, many people said prisons are probably going to go away because everybody knows they don't work, right? The population was just over 200,000. It wasn't that big a job factor right now. Now that we have over close to 2 million people in prisons and jails in the United States. And in some states, the highest number of state employees are university professors and prison staff, right? And, famously, California, New York used to spend more, I don't know if they still do or not, on their prisons than they do, on education. So switching those priorities. And again, there's nothing that I'm saying to you that isn't fully understood by incarcerated people, right? No individual may understand all those things, but you read them in aggregate, and all these things are answered. The maddening thing to me about all of this, and the book is hard to explicate this, researchers and politicians scratch their heads and say, well, we've got this problem. We've got inequality, right? We've got all these structural problems that exist. Maybe if we do this, it'll help. Maybe if we do that, it'll help. Then they throw it out there and see if it sticks. Listen to the people on the receiving end of all those problems. They can tell you what's not working, and they can make profound, and practical suggestions for what needs to be done. And we just never approach the problem that way, right? Largely because of social distance, right? Yeah. Wealthy people in the suburbs vote for laws that they assume are going to land on somebody else, right? It doesn't look like their kids. And that social distance is a major source of the problem.
Thank you.
Sure. Any others? We just got a couple of minutes left. Go ahead.
Quick question. You mentioned how different prisons are, one from the other. Huge variation in what you were calling culture in the prisons, and one dimension of that was just kind of toughness. Some are very tough in the way they deal with the imprisoned, and others are less so. So it seems like, despite all that difference across the prisonscape, that the essays that you get are, as you said, remarkably similar in the way so it's like the cultural aspects of things don't come through in the writing. Why do you think that is?
Well, it comes through. I mean, I wouldn't say it's just not there, right? You wouldn't notice it. But the basic problems, for example, the sort of disaster of medical care in prisons, that's universal. I've never read an essay saying, medical care is great, right? Everybody's getting better, from whatever the problems are. So the variation is sort of variation at a level, right? But within a range that people write about on a regular basis. And one of the reasons, that that I always emphasize is that every single individual is a single individual, right? And we should never sort of reduce them to just units in a mass. At the same time, we hear these echoes and choruses between the work that they're representing, all right? So the big variation is actually between women's and men's prisons. The sort of built-in capacity or danger of sexual exploitation and assault, because we let men guard women in prisons, is a fundamental difference. Not that there isn't sexual assault inside men's prisons, right? But the variations, again, within a range. Actually, this is one of the reasons that I really like the cover of this book. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, all the way back here. This cover image is by Eric Lynch, and he's a man who committed some robberies when he was a teenager in North Carolina, and he's still in prison. And so he proposed a couple of images, and what I like about this image is, in some sense, it's very representative of what's inside the book, right? So that there's a similarity between all these blocks, but there's no identity between the blocks, all right? So these are individuals. They look like they're in the same sort of structure, but they absolutely retain their individuality, all right? And people respond differently, to that. Also, you've got the issue that writers are always a subsection of any population, right? They're not the general public or the general population at all. So they're selected out, obviously, in that way. And also, we can't do a perfect mirroring of that population. We can't, just by putting, solicitation out. If you look at the archive and look at the number of essays from different states, it's largely a map of where our main solicitation source circulates, called Prison Legal News. And it's a news magazine that covers legislation and court precedents that affect incarcerated people. So it's largely known to be read by, quote unquote, jailhouse lawyers, right? They're looking for material, for arguing their cases or arguing cases for other people. Florida recently, a couple of years ago, actually blocked that magazine from coming in because they don't want incarcerated people to know what their rights are. And they brought it to the Supreme Court that deferred, as the court almost always does, defer to lower courts. And what they say is, well, prison administrators know how to do this. This isn't our expertise. So we defer to them, right? Is it safe or not safe to have this magazine in, right? So the courts have really not been a lot of help. There are exceptions, though. The famous cases in California, which the Supreme Court said you have to reduce your prison population by 40,000 people because people are dying of preventable causes every week, right? One person dying every week in the California system. And California is drastically reduced. They're closing prisons. New York State has reduced its prison population by over half over the last 15 or 20 years. It's a very uneven map across the country, right? Famously in Alabama, Governor Ivey took COVID money and built a $1 billion+ new prison. So some places it's just a really, really uneven map across the board. Any other questions? No. All right, we're at 4:00. Thank you all.